Welcome to a new series, By a Few Degrees, where direction, not chance, writes history. Only on your dose of Wowness.
We've spent 2 episodes talking about angles that took billions of years to matter. Today, we're talking about one that took about a week. July 1588. The most powerful navy on Earth sails into the English Channel, expecting to win. Everyone remembers that a storm supposedly wrecked the Spanish Armada that decided the fate of the fleet before the first North Atlantic gale ever formed. When King Philip II dispatched his fleet toward the English Channel, he was sending tens of thousands of men on roughly 130 ships. By contemporary standards, this force was heavily built, heavily gunned, and favored to win. Spain had already built a sprawling empire, and their galleons were designed to defend it. As they sailed up the coast, the Armada arranged itself into a massive, tightly packed crescent. It was a brilliant piece of defensive geometry. The heavily armed warships formed a protective outer wall, shielding the slower, more vulnerable transport and supply vessels in the center from any flanking maneuvers by the English. This is day 3 of By a Few Degrees. We're leaving deep time behind for a while and moving into human history, where it turns out the same rule still applies. Subscribe so you catch every episode in this run. For days, that crescent formation held perfectly. The fleet absorbed English harassment without breaking rank. What ultimately dismantled this floating fortress was not a tactical masterstroke from the English Navy, but an invisible, shifting variable: the wind. On the night of July 28th, the Spanish anchored off the coast of Calais. Taking advantage of the tide and the wind, the English sent 8 unmanned ships drifting directly toward the anchored Armada, deliberately set ablaze and packed with gunpowder and tar. The Spanish commanders feared these fireships would trigger massive explosions on contact. Rather than risk the blast, they made a frantic decision. They cut their anchor cables. In the darkness and confusion, the fleet scattered, abandoning their positions and permanently destroying the crescent formation. The following day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English capitalized on the chaos, engaging disorganized Spanish ships and inflicting heavy damage on several galleons. But the fighting did not wipe out the Armada. The vast majority of the Spanish vessels survived the cannons and remained entirely seaworthy. The fireships disrupted the fleet's defensive posture, but the Spanish remained afloat, heavily armed and capable of returning home. The fatal blow had not yet landed. Then, the mechanical hinge of the entire campaign swung shut. In the immediate aftermath of Gravelines, the prevailing winds shifted sharply against the Spanish position. Looking at this map of the English Channel and the Strait of Dover, you can see the geographic trap. To return home safely, the Spanish needed to sail south, back down the narrow corridor they had just come through. But the wind was now blowing firmly against a southerly course. It functioned as an invisible wall, physically blocking their retreat. Because they could not sail south against the wind, they had exactly one option left. They were forced to sail north. The Armada embarked on a grueling, incredibly long detour up and around the entire coastline of Scotland and Ireland, a route through open, volatile waters that their pilots barely knew. If you're enjoying seeing history through this angle and direction lens, let us know in the comments which of these 10 stories you'd never heard the mechanical version of before. It genuinely shapes what we cover next. At this exact point, the wind took command of the Spanish retreat. The English Navy didn't force them onto this northern path. The wind direction itself stripped the strongest fleet on Earth of its ability to choose its own way home. That forced push north blindly guided the Armada directly into a completely separate hazard: the violent North Atlantic storms of September 1588. These storm systems were fiercer than anything the Spanish crews were accustomed to in the Mediterranean. Galleons that had survived English cannons were violently driven into the rocky coastlines of Scotland and Ireland. The destruction was staggering, producing casualties and shipwrecks far exceeding anything the English had managed in direct combat. The violent North Atlantic storms ultimately destroyed the fleet. But those storms only claimed their prize because a single wind shift off Calais had already pushed the Armada into their crosshairs days earlier. Of the roughly 130 ships that originally sailed from Spain, fewer than half ever returned. The unquestioned naval supremacy Spain had enjoyed in Western Europe was fractured permanently. This defeat stands as a primary hinge point for the next 300 years of naval history. While Spain remained a major power for generations, the vacuum left in the Atlantic laid the groundwork for English maritime dominance and the eventual colonial expansion of the British Empire. The Fireship attack was a clever disruption. It was the meteorological reality of the wind that did the heavy lifting. The English fleet opened a tactical window, but the wind direction off Calais is what truly turned a survivable setback into a catastrophic retreat. The history of global power is often decided by which side of an uncontrollable weather system a fleet happens to occupy at a decisive moment. The Armada lost its cohesion and its path home because of the wind direction off Calais. The storm merely finished a process the wind had already made inevitable. Tomorrow, we stay on the water, but we shrink the timescale down even further, from a week to about 60 seconds. In 1912, a ship everyone called unsinkable had one final chance to turn away from an iceberg. What happened in that last minute is still argued about today. Tomorrow, Titanic's turn.